Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you are standing in the ruins of an ancient city. The air is thick with dust that never quite settles. The silence is absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through shattered walls. This is not the silence of peace. This is the silence that comes after annihilation. This is This is Nippur. This is the aftermath of a war so terrible that even the gods who waged it would come to regret what they had unleashed upon the world. Tonight we descend into the most forbidden chapter of ancient history, a chapter written not in ink but in blood, not on paper but on clay tablets that have survived 4,000 years to tell us a truth so disturbing that mainstream scholarship has struggled to explain it. We are going to explore what the Sumerian texts themselves reveal about the civil war between the Anunnaki, not the sanitized version, not the mythological interpretation, but the raw, terrifying account of when gods fought gods and humanity paid the ultimate price. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. The story we are about to unfold is not a comfortable one. It is not the story of benevolent creators watching over their children. It is a story of ambition, betrayal, succession disputes, and weapons so terrible they should never have been used. It is a story that mainstream archaeologists recognize in fragments but struggle to piece together into a coherent narrative. It is a story that alternative researchers like Zecharia Sitchin attempted to reconstruct, though his interpretations remain deeply controversial. But most importantly, it is a story told by the Sumerians themselves in texts that speak of divine warfare, nuclear-like destruction, and the collapse of the world's first great civilization. To understand this war, we must first understand the battlefield, not just the physical landscape of ancient Mesopotamia, but the complex web of divine politics, family rivalries, and succession rights that would tear the Anunnaki apart from within. You need to picture not a unified pantheon working in harmony, but a fractured family locked in a struggle that would last for millennia and ultimately destroy everything they had built. At the very beginning, there was a division of power. This is established fact in Mesopotamian mythology, documented across hundreds of cuneiform tablets. The supreme god Anu, whose name means heaven, ruled from the distant celestial realm. But Earth itself was divided between his two sons, born of different mothers. This detail is crucial. In ancient Mesopotamian succession law, the firstborn son did not automatically inherit everything. The system they used, which scholars call the law of succession by double seed, meant that a son born to a ruler and his official wife, his queen, had superior claim over an older son born to a concubine or secondary wife, even if that older son was born first. This is where our tragedy begins. Enki, whose name means Lord of Earth, was the firstborn son of Anu. He was brilliant, a master of science and technology, the keeper of the ME, those mysterious divine decrees or technologies that enabled civilization itself. Enki was given dominion over the Absu, the deep freshwater ocean beneath the earth, and the southern territories including Africa, where, according to the texts, the gold mining operations were established. He built his city of Eridu, the first city, and there he conducted his works of creation and engineering. But Enki had been born to a concubine. His half-brother Enlil, younger in years but born to Anu's official consort, held the superior claim by law. Enlil, whose name means Lord of Command, was appointed Earth's commander, ruler of Nippur, the sacred city that served as the command center for all Anunnaki operations on Earth. Where Enki was creative and compassionate, Enlil was a Jid, an authoritarian. Where Enki saw humanity as his children, Enlil saw them as tools. Where Enki sought to elevate, Enlil sought to control. You can feel the tension even in the ancient texts. They do not hide it. In the Atrahasis epic, one of our most important sources, we see this conflict play out repeatedly. When the Agigi, the worker gods, go on strike after millennia of backbreaking labour, it is Enki who proposes creating humanity as a solution, using his knowledge of genetics to fashion a new being from clay and divine essence. Enlil agrees because it serves his purposes, but from that moment forward, a fundamental disagreement emerges over the status and treatment of these new creatures. Enki views humanity with something approaching paternal affection. He He teaches them, guides them, even warns them of impending disasters. In text after text, we see Enki intervening to save human beings from Enlil's wrath. The most famous example is the flood. When Enlil, irritated by the noise of burgeoning humanity, decides to wipe them out with a great deluge, Enki defies the Divine Council's decision. He cannot openly break his oath of secrecy, so he employs a brilliant trick, speaking to the reed walls of Ziusudra's house, instructing the wall on how to build an ark, knowing full well that Ziusudra is listening on the other side. This is not mythology. This is recorded political tension between two factions of a ruling elite who disagreed fundamentally about the role and rights of the beings they had created. And this tension, this fundamental split in philosophy and policy, would cascade down through the generations of their descendants, setting the stage for wars that would reshape the ancient world. But the conflict between Enki and Enlil was only the beginning. The true catastrophe came when their children inherited their feud. Both Enki and Enlil had numerous offspring, many born on Earth to various goddesses and mortal women. These descendants formed distinct clans, each with their own territories, their own ambitions, and their own claims to power. The two most important figures in this next generation were Marduk, Enki's firstborn son by his official wife, and Ninurta, Enlil's warrior son. Marduk was brilliant, ambitious, and acutely aware that he had been passed over for ultimate authority despite being a legitimate heir through his mother's bloodline. Ancient texts describe him as dwelling in Egypt, where he was known as Ra, the sun god. He built his power base there, far from his father's city of Eridu, and he waited. He planned, and he seethed with resentment at a system that had denied him what he believed was rightfully his. Ninurta, on the other hand, was Enlil's champion, the perfect warrior, the mighty hunter. His temple in Nipper stood as a testament to his role as the enforcer of his father's will. Ninurta was everything Enlil valued, strong, loyal, unwavering in his dedication to the established order. He fought monsters, he slew demons, he brought order to chaos. The Sumerian texts sing his praises in compositions like Lugale, which describes his great victory over the demon Asag, and how he used the stones from his defeated enemies to build the mountains themselves, organising the rivers and streams to flow properly for agriculture and irrigation. But here is where the ancient texts become deeply interesting, and more than a little disturbing. Some scholars, examining these myths with fresh eyes, have proposed that these battles against monsters were not always battles against literal beasts. The Asag that Ninurta fought, for instance, is described in ways that sound suspiciously like a rival deity, not an inhuman monster. The demon is said to have known no father, to be ambitious and proud, to seek kingship. These are not the attributes typically assigned to mindless monsters, they are the attributes of a rival claimant to power. Could the epic of Ninurta slaying Asag actually be a veiled account of Ninurta defeating Marduk in an early conflict? The text says Asag had sired offspring in the mountains and spread his seeds far and wide. Marduk had temples and followers throughout many lands. The text says plants unanimously named Asag king over them. Marduk's symbol was agricultural fertility. The parallels are startling when you look at them closely. What we might be reading is not mythology, but encoded political history. A record of actual warfare between rival factions of the Anunnaki, with the monsters serving as literary stand-ins for the true enemies, other gods. The conflict escalated through what some researchers call the Pyramid Wars. These were a series of struggles for control over strategic installations, particularly in Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai was absolutely crucial to the Anunnaki infrastructure because, according to the ancient astronaut interpretation, it housed their primary spaceport, the installation that connected them to their home world. Control of the spaceport meant control over communication, transportation, and resupply. It was the ultimate strategic asset. Both sides desperately wanted it. Mainstream historians see the references to these conflicts as mythological or metaphorical. They point out that there is no archaeological evidence for ancient spaceports or nuclear warfare, and they are correct that the physical evidence for such installations has not been found, though proponents argue that we would not necessarily recognise such installations if we did find them, or that they were deliberately erased. But here is what we do have. We have texts, lots of texts, and these texts speak of prolonged periods of conflict between divine factions. We have the Era Epos, a Babylonian composition probably dating to the 8th or 9th century BCE, but recording events claim to be much older. This remarkable text describes a god named Era, identified with Nergal, another son of Enlil, going on a rampage of destruction. But the text is not describing random chaos. It is describing calculated, strategic warfare. In the Era epos, we see Era and his 7 weapons, the Sibiti, described as personified weapons without peer, each given a different destructive destiny by Anu. They burn like fire, blast like wind, paralyze with fear, collapse mountains. These are not normal weapons, these are weapons of mass destruction, and they are deployed not against mindless enemies, but against cities. Specific cities. Cities loyal to Marduk. The text tells us that Era tricks Marduk into leaving his city of Babylon, convincing him that he needs to travel to see his father Anu to have his divine vestments refurbished. While Marduk is away, Era unleashes devastation, but this backfires catastrophically. The destruction spreads beyond Era's intended targets. Babylon itself is ravaged. Foreign invaders pour into the chaos, and most terrifying of all, a plague sweeps across the land. Now we must pause and ask a very serious question. What could cause a plague so terrible that even the gods feared it? What could devastate multiple cities simultaneously, leaving them uninhabitable for generations? What could create the kind of destruction the texts describe? Burning, scorching, a wind that carried death, people dying not from swords but from something in the air itself. The controversial answer proposed by researchers like Zechariah Sitchin and Chris Hardy is that the Anunnaki used nuclear weapons. This theory is, it must be said clearly, rejected by virtually all mainstream archaeologists and historians. They argue that there is no credible physical evidence for nuclear weapons in the ancient world, and that the descriptions in the text can be adequately explained as literary embellishment of natural disasters or conventional warfare. And they make important points. Radiation leaves detectable traces, nuclear detonations create characteristic crater patterns, and glass-like trinitite where sand is fused by extreme heat. Such evidence has not been conclusively found at the alleged target sites, but proponents counter with several arguments. They point to unexplained radioactive skeletons found in archaeological contexts, though mainstream science attributes these to natural geological sources of radiation. They point to areas of vitrified rock in the Sinai and parts of the Middle East, though again, conventional explanation attributes these to lightning strikes or meteor impacts. They point to the strangely sudden collapse of Sumerian civilization around 2000 BCE, a collapse that mainstream history explains through a combination of Elamite invasions, climate change, and soil salinization from centuries of irrigation. What we can say with certainty is this: something catastrophic happened. The archaeological record confirms that Sumerian civilization, which had flourished for over a millennium, collapsed suddenly and dramatically around 2000 BCE. The great cities were abandoned. The intricate bureaucratic system stopped functioning. The flow of cuneiform tablets, which had been steady for centuries, nearly ceased. It was a collapse so complete that even the Sumerian language would eventually die out, surviving only as a liturgical language like Latin would centuries later. And we have the Lamentations. This is where the Sumerian texts themselves become almost unbearably poignant. After the catastrophe, the survivors wrote a series of compositions called city laments. The lamentation for Ur, the lamentation for Sumer and Ur, the lamentation for Nippur. These are not mythological tales. These are eyewitness accounts of destruction, preserved in literary form. Let me read you a few lines from the lamentation for Sumer and Ur, translated by modern Assyriologists from the original cuneiform tablets. Listen to these words carefully. On the land fell a calamity, one unknown to man, one that had never been seen before, one which could not be withstood, a great storm from heaven, a land-annihilating storm, an evil wind like a rushing torrent, a battling storm joined by a scorching heat. By day it deprived the land of the bright sun, in the evening the stars did not shine. The people, terrified, could hardly breathe. The evil wind clutched them, does not grant them another day. Mouths were drenched with blood, heads wallowed in blood. The face was made pale by the evil wind. It caused cities to be desolated, houses to become desolate, stalls to become desolate, the sheepfolds to be emptied. The rivers of Sumer were turned to bitter waters. The fields grew only weeds. The well-watered garden plots produced only salt. This is not poetic exaggeration. This is trauma. This is the literary equivalent of someone who has seen something so terrible they can barely find words to describe it. Notice the details. An evil wind that prevented breathing. Blood everywhere. The sun obscured by day. The stars not shining at night. Gardens producing only salt. Rivers turn bitter. These are the symptoms of catastrophic environmental disaster. Mainstream scholars interpret this as describing the aftermath of military invasion combined with possibly a dust storm or either other natural phenomenon. And that is a reasonable interpretation. War is horrific. Cities burned in antiquity do fill the air with choking smoke. Invading armies do slaughter populations. Agricultural fields can be deliberately salted to prevent future cultivation. All of this is historically documented. But there is one detail that keeps appearing in these texts that is harder to explain conventionally. The evil wind. This phrase appears again and again. It is not just any wind, it is specifically evil. It carries death. It comes from a specific direction. In the lamentation for Sumer and the text tells us that this evil wind was decreed by An and Enlil. It was deliberate, it was sent as a punishment, and it spread from the west, from the direction of the Sinai and the Dead Sea. This brings us to the most controversial claim in the ancient astronaut interpretation of these texts, that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, recorded in the Hebrew Bible, was actually part of this same catastrophic event. According to this theory, Sodom and Gomorrah were not destroyed by divine fire and brimstone as punishment for sin. They were strategic targets in the final phase of the Anunnaki civil war. Let me be clear about what mainstream biblical scholarship says. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, if they existed as historical places, were likely destroyed by natural causes, perhaps an earthquake or volcanic activity in the Jordan Valley, possibly combined with the ignition of natural gas or petroleum deposits in the region. The biblical account is seen as a later theological interpretation of this natural disaster used to make a moral point about divine justice and the consequences of wickedness. Many scholars doubt the cities existed at all, seeing them as purely literary constructions, but the story in Genesis does contain some very specific and very strange details. It describes Lot's wife looking back at the destruction and turning into a pillar of salt. It describes sulphur and fire raining down from heaven. It describes the smoke of the land going up like the smoke of a furnace. And crucially, it describes Abraham, seeing this destruction from a distance and being warned by angels not to look directly at it. Why would looking at the destruction be dangerous? Why would the angels urge them to flee to the mountains and not look back? The ancient astronaut interpretation proposes that what destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah was a nuclear strike aimed at eliminating Marduk's followers and destroying key installations in the region. The fire and sulphur from heaven were not metaphorical, they were real. The smoke going up like a furnace was a mushroom cloud. Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt because she was caught in the blast wave and heat that instantly dehydrated and crystallized her body. Abraham was told not to look directly at it because the light from the detonation would blind anyone who stared at it. This theory further proposes that the weapons used were so powerful that they created an unintended consequence. The evil wind, radioactive fallout that drifted east on the prevailing winds, contaminating everything in its path. This contamination reached the cities of Sumer, making the land uninhabitable, poisoning the water, killing the crops, and bringing down an entire civilization. Is this what really happened? The honest answer is that we cannot be certain. The physical evidence is ambiguous at best. No confirmed nuclear crater has been found. No indisputable radioactive contamination that cannot be explained by natural sources has been documented at Sodom, Gomorrah, or the Sumerian cities. The mainstream scholarly consensus, based on conventional archaeological methods, is that these interpretations go far beyond what the evidence supports. But we do know this: Sumerian civilization collapsed around 2000 BCE. The Lamentations describe an unprecedented calamity. The cities were abandoned, the culture was lost, and the survivors attributed this to a deliberate act by the gods, specifically mentioning a destructive wind that carried death from the west. Whether that destruction came from advanced weapons we cannot now identify, or from a combination of conventional warfare, environmental disaster and plague, the result was the same: devastation, collapse, the end of an age. Let us return now to the power struggle itself, because even if we cannot conclusively prove what weapons were used, we can trace the political conflict that led to the final confrontation. The struggle between Marduk and Ninurta reached its climax in the late 3rd millennium BCE, according to Sitchin's chronology around 234 BCE, though this dating is speculative and not accepted by mainstream historians. There is a fascinating text, fragmentary and difficult to interpret, that describes Marduk literally invading Nippur, the sacred city of Enlil, with an army of Anunnaki loyal to him. This would have been an unthinkable act of rebellion, akin to a Roman general marching on Rome itself. Nippur was not just any city, it was the religious centre, the place where the tablets of destiny were kept, the location of the assembly of the gods. To attack Nippur was to attack the very legitimacy of the existing power structure. The text, badly damaged but reconstructed by scholars, tells us that Marduk's invasion caused a flood that forced Enlil and the other gods of Nippur to take shelter in the Eshumesha, Ninurta's temple. Enlil, enraged by this transgression, ordered that Marduk and his Anunnaki followers be captured. They were captured, but Marduk appointed his general Mushtishir Hablim to lead a revolt, and he sent messengers to alert his son Nabu, the god of literacy and writing, who had his own substantial following. When the defenders of Nippur heard Nabu's speech, they came out of their fortified positions to search for him, and in that moment, Marduk's forces defeated them. The text tells us that Marduk took 360 gods as prisoners of war, including Enlil himself. The supreme commander of Earth was captured by his rival. Enlil protested that the gods of Nippur were innocent, that they had only been doing their duty, so Marduk put them on trial before an assembly of the Anunnaki. This is a remarkable detail. It suggests a legal framework, a concept of war crimes or rules of engagement even among the odds. The text ends with a warning from Damkiana, another name for Ninhursag, the mother goddess, pleading with both Earth gods and humanity never to repeat the war between the Anunnaki and the gods of Eshumesha. But the warning was not heeded. The conflict continued, and it escalated to the point where, according to the controversial interpretation, the decision was made to use the ultimate weapons. The Era epos tells us that Era and Ninurta, called Isham in some versions, deployed 7 terrible weapons, the Sibiti, and that these weapons destroyed 5 cities in the Jordan Plain, including Sodom and Gomorrah, while also targeting the spaceport installations in the Sinai. The goal was strategic: to deny Marduk access to the space facilities, to eliminate his power base in Canaan, to finally crush his rebellion once and for all. But the plan went catastrophically wrong. The evil wind, whether radioactive fallout or some other consequence of the weapons used, drifted east and contaminated the heartland of Mesopotamia itself. Sumer, the jewel of Anunnaki civilization, the place where it all began, was poisoned. The cities that had stood for thousands of years became uninhabitable. And here is the tragic irony. Marduk's city of Babylon was largely spared. It lay to the north, out of the path of the evil wind. When the dust settled, when the contamination had made the southern cities unlivable, Babylon emerged as the new centre of power. Marduk had won after all, not through victory in battle, but through sheer survival. The gods who had tried to destroy him had instead destroyed their own heartland. Babylon would rise to dominate Mesopotamia for the next 2 millennia. Marduk would indeed become the supreme god, not by defeating his rivals directly, but by outlasting them. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that we examined in our previous video, should be understood in this context. It is not just a creation myth, it is a political document. It was written to justify and celebrate Marduk's rise to supremacy. The story of Marduk defeating the chaos dragon Tiamat and creating the world from her corpse is a metaphor for Marduk defeating the old order, represented by Enlil's faction, and establishing a new cosmic arrangement with himself at its centre. By the 1st millennium BCE, Marduk's cult had become so dominant that other gods were literally redefined as aspects of Marduk. A god list from late Babylonian period identifies all the other major deities as manifestations of Marduk's power. Ninurta was Marduk of the pickaxe, Nabu was Marduk of accounting, Shamash was Marduk of justice. This is not theology in the way we usually think of it. This is the victor writing history. This is Marduk's faction, ensuring that their version of events became the official orthodoxy. But what happened to the other gods? Where did they go after this catastrophe? The texts become more ambiguous here. We are told that many of the Anunnaki left Earth entirely. Some versions suggest they returned to their homeworld, their mission accomplished or failed depending on your perspective. Other interpretations propose they went into hiding. withdrawing from direct human contact and ruling from the shadows through intermediary priesthoods and bloodlines. There is a consistent theme in texts from multiple cultures that the gods became more distant over time. They stopped appearing physically. They stopped speaking directly to their worshippers. Their interactions became mediated through dreams, omens, and priestly interpretation. The age of direct divine intervention ended. Whether this was because they literally left, or because they chose to operate more subtly, or because they never existed in the literal sense at all, but were mythological personifications of natural forces and political powers, is a question that each person must answer for themselves. What we can document is the human cost. The Sumerian civilization that had invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, law codes, and urban planning simply collapsed. The population of the southern Mesopotamian cities plummeted. Many sites were abandoned entirely and never reoccupied. The survivors migrated north to areas less affected by whatever calamity had struck. The Sumerian language, the world's first written language, gradually ceased to be spoken. Though it was preserved as a sacred language by priests much as Latin was preserved by the medieval church. There is something profoundly tragic about reading the Lamentations knowing that they document the end of a world. These were not primitive people. The Sumerians at their height were sophisticated, literate, technologically advanced by the standards of their era. They had libraries, schools, courts of law, international trade networks. They studied the stars with remarkable precision. They wrote poetry that can still move us today after 4,000 years. And it all came crashing down, whether through nuclear warfare as Sitchin proposed, or through conventional warfare and environmental catastrophe as mainstream history suggests. The Lamentations preserve their anguish. In Urim, no one went to fetch food, no one went to fetch water, as people rushed around like water being poured from a well. Their strength ebbed away, they could not even go on their way. In the city, those who had not been felled by weapons succumbed to hunger. Hunger filled the city like water, it would not seem nor cease. This hunger contorted people's faces, twisted their muscles. Its people were as if drowning in a pond. They gasped for breath. These are the words of survivors describing the aftermath of total social collapse. The infrastructure broke down. Food distribution ceased. Clean water became unavailable. People died from violence, then from starvation, then from thirst. The normal human response to such conditions is to flee, and many did, but others stayed, hoping the gods would return, hoping the evil would pass, hoping their priests could perform the right rituals to restore divine favour. They stayed and they died and they were mourned in these lamentations. Now let us address the elephant in the room. How much of this is literally true? Were the Anunnaki real extraterrestrial beings who fought a nuclear war over Earth? Or are these texts doing what ancient literature always did, using dramatic mythological language to describe all too human political conflicts and natural disasters? The honest answer is that the physical evidence is insufficient to prove the ancient astronaut interpretation, while the literary and archaeological evidence clearly documents a major catastrophe and power shift in Mesopotamian civilization around 2000 BCE. What we can state as established historical fact based on mainstream archaeological and textual scholarship is the following. Ancient Mesopotamian texts describe a pantheon of gods organised in a hierarchical system with clear familial relationships and territorial divisions. These gods were understood to have conflicts, rivalries and wars with each other. The mythology served multiple functions, explaining natural phenomena, justifying political authority, preserving cultural memory, and exploring philosophical and ethical questions about power, justice, and the relationship between the divine and human realms. The Sumerian city laments are real texts, preserved on numerous clay tablets, describing catastrophic destruction using vivid and consistent imagery across multiple compositions. These texts were composed shortly after the fall of the Ur-III dynasty around 2000 BCE, documenting a period of political collapse, foreign invasion, famine, and city destruction. The causes of this collapse are debated among historians, but mainstream consensus points to a combination of factors: military defeat by the Elamites, internal political fragmentation, environmental degradation from soil salinization, and possibly climate change affecting agricultural productivity. The Era Epos is a real text, multiple copies found at various ancient sites, describing divine warfare and destruction in unusually explicit and disturbing detail. While mainstream scholars interpret this as mythologized memory of historical turmoil, possibly the Assyrian conquest of Babylon, The text's widespread copying and magical use as protective amulets suggests it held special significance in ancient Mesopotamian culture. The succession dispute between different lines of descent, particularly tensions between firstborn sons and sons born to official wives, is a well-documented theme in Mesopotamian mythology and reflected real political tensions in how power was transferred in ancient Near Eastern societies. The characterization of Enki as wise and pro-human versus Enlil as authoritarian and prone to harsh judgments is consistent across multiple independent textual sources. Whether one interprets these texts as recording actual events involving extraterrestrial beings, or as sophisticated political mythology created by human priests and scribes to explain their world, the texts themselves remain fascinating documents that reveal how the ancient Mesopotamians understood power, conflict, justice, and catastrophe. They also reveal something universal about human nature: our capacity for self-destruction, the way conflicts escalate beyond anyone's control, how those who start wars often become its victim, and how the innocent always suffer most when powers fight. The warning in the texts, the plea from Ninasag to never repeat the war between the Anunnaki, resonates across the millennia. Whether she was an actual goddess speaking to her divine children, or a literary invention giving voice to the horror of war-torn survivors, her message is timeless. Do not repeat this. Do not let ambition and rivalry blind you to the cost. Do not deploy weapons that will poison your own lands. Do not destroy in the pursuit of victory what makes victory worth having. Looking at the ruins of Ur today, at the massive ziggurat that still stands after 4,000 years while the living city around it is dust, you cannot help but feel the weight of history. Something happened here. Something terrible. Whether it was nuclear weapons or conventional warfare or a combination of human folly and natural disaster, an entire civilization fell. The survivors picked up the pieces and carried on, but it was never the same. The Sumerian language died. The cities were never fully rebuilt to their former glory. The age of Sumer was over. The age of Babylon had begun. And perhaps that is the real truth hidden in these texts. Not the specific weapons used or the literal nature of the Anunnaki, but the pattern. Civilizations rise, powers compete, wars escalate, and when the dust settles, often both the victors and the vanquished have lost something irreplaceable. Marduk may have won his throne, but the cost was the destruction of the very civilization that throne was meant to rule over. What kind of victory is that? There is a moment in the Era epos near the end where Isham finally manages to calm Era's rage and reason with him. Era realizes what he has done. The destruction he has caused was not what he intended. He wanted to restore order, to defeat his enemies, to secure his position. Instead, he created chaos. He killed indiscriminately. He poisoned the land. He destroyed the very things he was trying to protect. This is the moment of tragic recognition that appears in epic literature across cultures. The moment when the hero or anti-hero realizes the true consequences of their actions and that there is no going back. Era cannot undo what he has done. The cities are destroyed. The people are dead. The evil wind has already blown. All he can do is retreat to his temple, the text tells us, and mankind is saved from total annihilation only because he finally stops. This brings us back to the essential question that has run underneath this entire exploration. What are these texts trying to tell us? Are they warning us about actual historical events, serving as a kind of ancient disaster preparedness manual? Look at what happened to us. Do not let it happen again. Or are they doing what mythology has always done, using dramatic supernatural narratives to explore very human themes of power, hubris, conflict, and consequence? The answer may be that they are doing both. The ancient Mesopotamians were sophisticated thinkers. They were capable of encoding multiple layers of meaning in their texts. On one level, yes, these are religious myths about gods and their conflicts. On another level, they clearly reflect real political tensions and historical events. The fall of Ur is historical fact. The Elamite invasion happened. The city was destroyed and never fully recovered its former status. But the Sumerians chose to explain and memorialize this disaster through a theological framework because that was how they understood causation. Great events required great causes. The collapse of civilization required divine agency. Whether the divine agency was literal beings wielding advanced weapons or metaphorical representations of human armies and natural disasters elevated to cosmic significance, the emotional and moral truth of the texts remains valid. War is hell. Power struggles destroy what they seek to control. Weapons of mass destruction, once used, cannot be unused. The innocent suffer most, and the survivors are left to pick up the pieces and ask how it all went so terribly wrong. In the 4,000 years since these events, whatever their exact nature, humanity has not learned these lessons as well as we might hope. We have bigger weapons now. The nuclear arms, built in the 20th century, make whatever the Anunnaki allegedly used look like firecrackers. We have the capacity to poison not just regions but the entire planet. We have the capacity to make not just individual cities but entire continents uninhabitable. And we are still fighting over the same things: territory, resources, ideology, succession, power. The Sumerian lamentations should be a required reading for anyone with their finger near a button that could unleash such weapons. The evil wind that deprived the land of the bright sun. The water turned bitter. The fields producing only salt. The people gasping for breath. This is what happens when conflicts escalate beyond control. This is what happens when short-term strategic thinking overrides concern for long-term consequences. This is what happens when winning matters more than what you are fighting for. There is archaeological evidence that suggests the southern Mesopotamian environment did undergo serious degradation in the late 3rd millennium BCE. Soil samples show increasing salinization. Cuneiform records show declining crop yields. The agricultural system that had supported dense urban populations for over 1,000 years began to fail. Whether this was purely the result of natural processes, over-exploitation of the land through intensive irrigation, climate shifts, or some more dramatic acute event, the result was catastrophic for Sumerian civilization. The survivors had to adapt. They shifted to more salt-tolerant crops. They moved north to less affected regions. They reorganized politically under new rulers. But they never forgot what they had lost. The lamentations preserve that memory. They were performed ritually for centuries after, keeping alive the story of the fall as a warning, as a mourning, and as a prayer that it never happen again. Some researchers have proposed that the detailed ritual preservation of these lamentations, copied and recopied by scribes for over 1,000 years, suggests they were serving a function beyond simple religious devotion. They were consciously maintaining a memory of something so important it must never be forgotten. What was that thing? If you accept the ancient astronaut interpretation, it was the memory of when the gods went to war and destroyed the world. If you take the mainstream view, it was simply the memory of a dark age, a time of collapse and suffering that the survivors wanted their descendants to remember, so they might avoid repeating the mistakes that led to it. Either way, the texts themselves are real. The archaeology is real. Something happened that traumatized an entire civilization so deeply that they spent the next millennium writing about it, ritually mourning it and warning future generations about it. That alone makes these texts worthy of serious attention, regardless of how literally or metaphorically we interpret their more fantastical elements. As our journey through this dark chapter of ancient history comes to a close, we are left with more questions than answers. But perhaps that's appropriate. The ancient Mesopotamians themselves did not have all the answers. The lamentations are filled with questions. Why did this happen? What did we do to deserve this? Why did the gods abandon us? When will they return? Will there ever again be peace? These questions echo across the centuries and sound eerily familiar because we are still asking them. After every war, every disaster, every collapse, humanity asks the same questions. Why? Could it have been prevented? What do we do now? How do we make sure it never happens again? But before we can answer these eternal questions, we must dig deeper into the specific mechanisms of the conflict itself. We must examine the succession law that started it all, trace the territorial divisions that became battlegrounds, and explore the evidence, both textual and archaeological, that points to what really happened in those final catastrophic years. The law of succession that governed the Anunnaki, and that would tear them apart, was not arbitrary. It was based on a principle that mainstream historians recognise as genuinely present in ancient Near Eastern royal succession practices, though it was not universal and varied by time and place. The principle held that legitimacy depended on the mother's status as much as, or even more than, birth order. A son born to a ruler's official wife, his queen, had superior claim over an older son born to a secondary wife or concubine, even if that firstborn son was older and more experienced. This system created built-in tensions in any polygamous ruling family, and polygamy was the norm for ancient Near Eastern royalty. Kings married for political alliance, for love, for dynasty building. They took concubines for pleasure or to demonstrate their virility and power. A successful ruler might have dozens of children by different women. Each of those children represented potential. Each was educated, trained, given positions of authority, but only some could be legitimate heirs. In the Anunnaki family structure as presented in the texts, this tension reached its ultimate expression. Anu, the supreme god, had multiple consorts. His firstborn son was Enki, brilliant and capable, but born to a secondary wife. His younger son was Enlil, born to his official queen. When the time came to divide Earth's territories, Enlil's claim, though younger, was considered superior. Enki received the Abzu, the watery depths, important but secondary. Enlil received Nippur, the command centre, the heart of power. You can imagine the resentment. Enki was firstborn. He was older, more experienced, arguably more creative and scientifically advanced than his brother. By the logic of primogeniture, which we associate with later European monarchies, he should have been the heir. But by the logic of double-seed succession, he had been born to the wrong mother. His entire life would be shaped by this accident of birth, this technicality of legitimacy. And the resentment would flow down through his descendants, particularly his son Marduk, who inherited both his father's brilliance and his father's sense of having been cheated. Marduk's situation was even more complex. He was Enki's firstborn son by his official wife Damkina. That should have given him a strong claim, but the system required not just legitimacy of birth, but recognition by the existing power structure. And Enlil's faction controlled that structure. They controlled the assembly of the gods. They controlled Nippur, where fates were decreed. They had institutional power. Marduk had legitimacy of blood. But legitimacy without power is just a grievance waiting to explode. The territorial divisions established in the early period would become the fault lines of future conflicts. According to the text as interpreted by alternative researchers, the Anunnaki divided Earth into distinct regions. Enki's clan held dominion over Africa, specifically the southeast, corresponding roughly to modern Zimbabwe and South Africa, where the gold mining operations were allegedly concentrated. Enki also held Eridu in southern Mesopotamia and influence over the Indus Valley. His sons spread throughout these regions, establishing their own power bases. Enlil's clan held northern Mesopotamia, with Nippur as the supreme command centre. Ninurta, his warrior son, controlled regions associated with the Tigris River and the mountains to the northeast. Ninurta's twin brother Nanna, the moon god, held Ur and Haran. Another son, Ishkur, known in Akkadian as Adad, controlled areas associated with storms and mountains, possibly Anatolia and the Levant. The goddess Inanna, daughter of Nanna and thus Enlil's granddaughter, held the great city of Uruk and had ambitions that often put her at odds with both factions. But the most contested territory was Egypt and the Sinai. Egypt was incredibly rich, the breadbasket of the ancient world, with reliable flooding from the Nile providing consistent agriculture that Mesopotamia's temperamental rivers could not match. Egypt also had gold, though perhaps not in the quantities found in southern Africa. Most importantly, Egypt had strategic position, controlled trade routes. It controlled access between Africa and Asia. And according to the ancient astronaut interpretation, it was in Egypt and the Sinai that the Anunnaki established their most important technological installations. Marduk established himself in Egypt early, according to these theories. He became Ra, the sun god's supreme deity, of the Egyptian pantheon. He built his power base far from his father's territories in Mesopotamia, far from the oversight of Enlil's faction. Egypt would be his kingdom, his chance to rule as he believed he should. But Enlil's sons, particularly Ninurta, also had claims to Egypt, and both sides coveted the Sinai, that strategic peninsula that separated them, where the alleged spaceport was located. The First Pyramid Wars, according to Sitchin's reconstruction, erupted over the control of these installations. The term Pyramid Wars comes from the theory that the Great Pyramids and other massive stone structures of Egypt and elsewhere were not just tombs or temples, but served technological functions for the Anunnaki. Some versions of this theory propose they were power plants, energy generators, communication arrays, or navigation beacons for spacecraft. Mainstream Egyptology firmly rejects these interpretations, demonstrating through extensive archaeological evidence that the pyramids were royal tombs built through well-understood ancient construction techniques, but the ancient astronaut theorists point to certain features they claim are anomalous. The incredible precision of the pyramid construction with massive stone blocks fitted so tightly that a knife blade cannot fit between them. The astronomical alignments, particularly the correlation of the 3 Giza pyramids with the stars of Orion's belt. The presence of shafts that appear to have no function if the structures were merely tombs, but might have served as conduits or channels for energy or light. The absence of definitive burial evidence in some pyramids despite their identification as tombs. The presence of what appears to be advanced tooling marks on stone that should, by conventional understanding, have been worked with copper or bronze tools. Mainstream archaeology explains each of these points. The precision came from skilled craftsmanship and techniques refined over generations. The astronomical alignments reflected the Egyptians' sophisticated understanding of the heavens and their religious beliefs about the afterlife journey. The shafts were for ventilation during construction, or had religious significance related to the soul's journey. Burial evidence was often destroyed by tomb robbers in antiquity. The tooling marks can be replicated with known ancient technology given sufficient time and effort. But the debate continues because on both sides there are reasonable people making reasonable arguments from their interpretive frameworks. What matters for our story is that according to the ancient texts and the alternative interpretation of them, Egypt and the Sinai were contested territories, fought over by rival divine factions for generations, and the fighting was not always metaphorical. One of the most intriguing pieces of textual evidence is a damaged but partially reconstructed account that describes actual combat between divine forces. The tablet, designated as the myth of Zu in its standard version, but with Marduk variant readings in some copies, tells of the theft of the tablets of destiny. These were not mere symbols. In Mesopotamian theology, the tablets of destiny were the physical objects that conferred legitimate authority to rule. Possession of them meant you held the mandate of heaven. Without them, even the supreme god was just another powerful being. In the standard version, a divine bird monster named Zu steals the tablets from Enlil. In variant versions, the thief is associated with Marduk or his faction. The theft throws the cosmos into crisis. Without the tablets of destiny, the natural order breaks down. Ninurta is dispatched to recover them. He pursues the thief through multiple battles, fighting against tremendous odds, because the thief, now possessing the tablets, can decree fates and alter reality itself. Eventually, through cunning and valour, Ninurta succeeds in recovering the tablets and restoring them to Enlil. This myth, which scholars generally interpret as a standard creation order story about the hero establishing cosmic order against chaos, takes on new meaning if read as political allegory. Marduk or his agents attempted to seize the legitimate instruments of authority. This was not just theft, it was a coup attempt. Ninurta, as Enlil's champion, stopped the coup and restored the existing power structure. But the attempt had been made. The cracks in divine unity were showing. War was no longer unthinkable. It was inevitable. The texts describe multiple phases of conflict. There were battles at the Ekur in Nippur. There were conflicts in the highlands between Mesopotamia and Anatolia. There were confrontations in the mountains and the cedar forests. Each battle story, whether we read it as mythology or encoded history, shows the same pattern. A challenge to authority. A military response. Temporary resolution. But the underlying tensions unresolved. The system required a clear hierarchy, but the hierarchy was contested. Legitimacy was claimed by multiple parties. And no conflict ever truly settled the matter. This brings us to the weapons. The texts are quite specific, sometimes disturbingly so, in describing divine armaments. We have already discussed the Sabiti, the 7 in the Era epos, described as champions without peer, each charged with a specific form of destruction. But other texts also describe advanced weaponry in the hands of the gods. Ninurta is frequently described with his mace Sha'arur, whose name means smasher of thousands. But Sha'arur is not just a club. In some texts, it is described as capable of independent action, of speech, of moving through the air, and reporting back to Ninurta. It sounds less like a primitive weapon, and more like some kind of autonomous drone or missile. Marduk's weapons in the Enuma Elish include the evil wind that he releases into Tiamat's mouth, inflating her like a balloon so she cannot close her jaws, allowing him to shoot an arrow into her heart, the net that he casts over her, the lightning that he wields. These are not the weapons of Bronze Age combat. They sound like energy weapons, projectile weapons, capture devices. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when the hero travels to the cedar forest to confront the guardian Humbaba, The monster is described as having 7 fearsome auras or terrors that shine around him. When Shamash, the sun god, helps Gilgamesh defeat Humbaba, he does so by sending 13 winds to trap the monster, paralysing him. These winds are not natural weather phenomena. They are directed, weaponized, deployed strategically. Mainstream scholars interpret all of this as mythological embellishment, the natural tendency of ancient literature to describe battles in cosmic, exaggerated terms. The storm god wields lightning because storms produce lightning. The war god's weapon has a fearsome name because warriors name their weapons and tell stories about them. The 7 terrors or 7 weapons are literary devices, not literal descriptions of arsenal. But alternative interpreters ask, what if the ancient authors were trying to describe, in the only vocabulary available to them, things that were beyond their understanding? If you had never seen a missile or a laser or a drone, how would you describe it? You might say it flies through the air like a bird but shines like the sun. You might say it roars like a lion. You might say it strikes like lightning. You would use metaphor drawn from your natural world to describe something supernatural or super-technological. This question of literal versus figurative interpretation is central to the entire ancient astronaut debate. Are we meant to read these texts as fantasy, as theology, as political allegory, or as garbled technical descriptions? The answer probably depends as much on one's interpretive framework and presuppositions as on the texts themselves. What we can say is that whatever weapons were used, whether they were bronze swords and arrows or something far more advanced, the conflicts described in the texts had real-world consequences. Cities were destroyed, dynasties fell, populations were displaced. The archaeological record confirms this much. The interpretation of why and how varies wildly, but the what is clear. Catastrophic events occurred. The Lamentations give us that ground-level view of catastrophe. They are not cosmic myths. They are personal tragedies writ large. Listen to these lines from the Lamentation for Uruk. O Father Nana, that city into ruins was made, the people groan. O Father Nana, its walls were breached, the people groan. In its lofty gates where they were wont to promenade, dead bodies were lying about. In its boulevards where the feasts were celebrated, scattered they lay. In all its streets where they were wont to promenade, dead bodies were lying about. In its places where the festivities of the land took place, the people were laid in heaps. This is not describing divine warfare in heaven. This is describing the aftermath of very earthly urban destruction. Bodies in the streets, festivals that will never happen again. Gates breached by enemies, the proud city reduced to ruin. Whether those enemies were human armies following divine commands, or gods themselves wielding advanced weapons, makes little practical difference to the dead, and there were so many dead. The archaeological evidence from the period of Earthree's collapse shows dramatic population decline. Settlements that had been occupied for centuries were abandoned. Smaller sites disappeared entirely. Larger cities show burn layers, destruction debris, hasty burials or unburied bodies. This was not a peaceful transition of power. This was violent upheaval on a civilization-destroying scale. The Elamites get much of the blame in the historical record. They invaded from the east, from what is now southwestern Iran, and sacked Ur, capturing the last king Ibi-Sin and carrying him off into captivity from which he never returned. This is documented history, confirmed by multiple sources. But what the Lamentations describe seems to be more than just a military invasion. They describe environmental catastrophe. They describe the land itself becoming poisoned. They describe something that even the victorious Elamites could not control or stop. This is where the nuclear hypothesis attempts to fit the pieces together. According to this theory, the Elamite invasion was just one component of a larger conflict. The real target was not just Ur, but the entire southern Mesopotamian power base of the rival faction. The weapons deployed, whether by Ninurta and Nergal as claimed, were meant to destroy strategic installations and enemy strongholds. The spaceport in the Sinai. The cities where Marduk's followers were concentrated, including the 5 cities of the plain Sodom and Gomorrah among them. Possibly fortified positions in the mountains, but the weapons created fallout, contamination that drifted on the wind. This evil wind, repeatedly mentioned in the Lamentations, carried radioactive particles, chemical poisons, or some other form of lingering environmental toxin. It poisoned water supplies, it contaminated soil, it made crops fail, it caused illness and death. not through direct violence but through invisible, lingering effects that people could not understand and could not fight. The mainstream explanation is that the evil wind is a literary metaphor for the invasion itself, or possibly references to actual sandstorms or weather phenomena that exacerbated the crisis. Invading armies do poison wells deliberately to deny them to defenders. Sieges do lead to famine and disease. Natural disasters like drought or crop failure often accompany periods of political instability. The poetic language of the Lamentations is meant to convey horror and loss, not to provide technical specifications of the catastrophe's cause. Both interpretations are trying to make sense of texts that are genuinely ambiguous. The beauty and frustration of ancient literature is that it was written for audiences who shared cultural context we no longer have. References that would have been obvious to a Sumerian scribe are opaque to us. Metaphors we interpret literally might have been clearly understood as figurative by their original readers, and vice versa. But one thing the Lamentations make absolutely clear is that the survivors believed the catastrophe was not random. It was deliberate. The gods decided this. Specifically, Anu and Enlil decreed the destruction of Sumer. They called up the evil wind. They withdrew their protection from the cities. This was punishment, or policy, or the outcome of divine conflict. But it was intentional. The texts are emphatic about this. The fate could not be changed. The command of Anu and Enlil could not be opposed. This theological interpretation preserved in the Lamentations tells us something important about Sumerian religion and psychology. They did not see catastrophe as mere misfortune. They saw it as having cosmic meaning. Great suffering required great cause. The collapse of their entire civilization could not be just bad luck or human error. It had to be divine will. This worldview shaped how they recorded the events, how they remembered them, and how they passed that memory down. And this brings us full circle to the question of the Anunnaki civil war. Whether these beings were literal extraterrestrials, mythologized human rulers, or pure theological constructs, the pattern of the story reveals something true about power and its consequences. The story structure is the same regardless of interpretation. A house divided against itself, rival claimants to authority. Escalating conflict as compromise becomes impossible. The deployment of terrible weapons, devastating consequences that exceed anyone's intentions. Pyrrhic victory where the winners inherit ruins, and survivors left to mourn and ask how it all went so wrong. This pattern is not unique to Sumerian texts. It appears in the Greek tragedies where the house of Atreus tears itself apart through generations of revenge. It appears in Norse mythology where the Aesir and Vanir wage war before finally making peace. It appears in Hindu epics where divine and semi-divine beings fight catastrophic wars that reshape the world. It appears in every culture's mythology because it reflects something universal about human political and family conflict. The question is not whether these patterns are real. They obviously are. Family conflicts do tear apart kingdoms, succession disputes do lead to civil wars, wars do escalate beyond anyone's control, weapons do create unintended consequences, civilizations do collapse. These are historical facts, repeated across time and geography. The question that divides mainstream scholarship from alternative theories is whether the ancient texts are describing these universal patterns through fictional mythological narratives, or whether they are describing actual historical events involving actual actors who might have been something more than human. And that question ultimately cannot be settled by the texts alone. It requires physical evidence. It requires artifacts that can be tested, sites that can be excavated, traces that can be dated and analysed. The frustration for proponents of the ancient astronaut theory is that the physical evidence they claim exists is not accepted as proof by mainstream science. Radioactive skeletons can be explained by natural radiation sources in geology. Vitrified rocks can be explained by lightning strikes, meteor impacts, or ancient pottery kilns. Sudden civilization collapse can be explained by conventional warfare plus environmental factors. Advanced knowledge in ancient texts can be explained by centuries of careful observation and sophisticated indigenous science. Every piece of evidence has an alternative conventional explanation. And by the scientific principle of parsimony, the explanation that requires fewer unsupported assumptions is preferred. Extraterrestrial beings with nuclear weapons require us to assume many things we cannot prove. Natural disasters, plus conventional warfare, plus theological interpretation of events, only requires us to assume what we already know happens regularly throughout history. But proponents counter that mainstream science's explanation has strained credibility in their own ways. How do we explain the incredible precision of the pyramids using only copper tools? We don't fully, they say, though we have theories. How do we explain sophisticated astronomical knowledge appearing suddenly in multiple cultures? It developed over time, we say, though the evidence for gradual development is sometimes thin. How do we explain the eerily similar flood myths across unconnected cultures? Human populations often live near water, floods are common, and the stories spread through contact or reflect universal human experiences, we say. Each side accuses the other of cherry-picking evidence, ignoring contradictions, and seeing what they want to see. Each side is probably partly right in that accusation. This is how controversial topics remain controversial. The evidence is genuinely ambiguous. Reasonable people with different background assumptions interpret it differently. What we can do, what we are attempting to do tonight, is present the textual evidence as honestly as possible. Explain both interpretations and acknowledge where certainty ends and speculation begins. The Sumerian texts exist. They describe divine conflicts. They describe catastrophic destruction. They preserve genuine trauma and historical memory of civilization collapse. How we interpret those descriptions depends on our framework. But let us return once more to the human level, to the survivors, to the people who lived through these events and tried to make sense of them. Imagine you are a scribe in Ur in the years after the collapse. Your city, which had been the greatest in the world, is devastated. The ziggurat still stands, that massive stepped pyramid of mud brick, but the living city around it is largely empty. Where once 100,000 people lived and worked, and laughed and quarrelled, now perhaps only 10,000 remain. The others are dead or fled or carried off as captives. Your family's scribal school, which had trained you and your father and your grandfather before you, is closed. There are no students, there are no contracts to write, there is no functioning government to keep records for. But you have clay and you have your stylus, and you have your training, and you feel an overwhelming need to record what has happened. Not for pay, not for glory, but because if someone does not write this down, it will be forgotten, and it must not be forgotten. So you begin. You write in the traditional forms, using the liturgical and mesal dialect for the voices of the goddesses who mourn. You follow the formal structure of a lamentation, but you pour into it everything you have seen and felt. The destruction, the fear, the hunger, the bodies, the silence where there should be song, the darkness where there should be light, and most painfully the absence of the gods. Because that is what truly traumatized the survivors. Not just the physical destruction, but the theological crisis. Where were the gods? The temples were kept pure, the sacrifices had been made, the rituals properly performed. And yet the gods did not protect the cities. They withdrew. Or perhaps even more terrifying, they themselves caused the destruction. Father Enlil decreed it and approved it. The divine council voted for it, and nothing humans could do made any difference. This crisis of faith, this desperate attempt to understand why the gods would do this, permeates the lamentations. In some passages, the gods are portrayed as victims too, weeping for their destroyed cities, unable to prevent the catastrophe even though they wanted to. In other passages, the destruction is portrayed as necessary punishment, though for what crime is never clearly stated. The texts struggle to reconcile divine power, divine justice, and the reality of innocent suffering. This is theology being worked out in real time by people processing massive trauma. It is some of the most raw, honest religious literature we have from the ancient world, and it is heartbreaking. Listen to this passage from the Lamentation for Nippur. O Father Enlil, your destroyed city, your destroyed house. At the place of your city you did not stand, at the place of your city that had been turned into ruins you did not stand. Its foundations made like dust, its high walls you overturned. You let foreigners dwell in it, but you yourself drew away your foot from your own city. O you who are a roaring flood, what have you done to your city? There is such pain in those questions. What have you done? Why did you leave? Why did you let this happen? These are the questions survivors always ask after catastrophe. And the gods, like the gods of Job in the Hebrew Bible when confronted with the question of undeserved suffering, do not give satisfying answers in these texts. The catastrophe was fated. The command could not be overturned. The word of Anu and Enlil stands firm. In other words, We did this because we chose to, and we do not owe you an explanation. It is this cold divine authority, this refusal to be questioned or held accountable, that made some of the gods, particularly Enlil, seem more tyrant than father in these later texts. And it is why Enki, who consistently helped humanity even against divine decree, remained a beloved figure in Mesopotamian religion, even as the political fortunes of his city Eridu declined. The memory of this catastrophe shaped Mesopotamian religion for centuries after. The lamentations continued to be copied and ritually performed well into the first millennium BCE, over 1,000 years after the events they describe. Priests in Babylon, long after Babylon had risen to replace and Sumer's other fallen cities as the dominant power, still chanted these ancient mourning songs. Why? Because the lesson they encoded was too important to forget. The gods could turn on you. Power could collapse overnight. Civilization was fragile. Never forget, never become complacent, never assume the order will hold forever. In a strange way, the catastrophe that ended Sumerian civilization created a permanent theological and psychological scar in Mesopotamian consciousness. A healthy paranoia, a suspicion that the world could end at any moment if the gods willed it. This made Mesopotamian religion, and the societies built on it, both fatalistic and intensely focused on maintaining divine favour through proper ritual. If the cosmos was fundamentally unstable, if the gods were prone to sudden violent mood swings, then the only safety lay in perfect performance of the cult, perfect sacrifice, perfect prayer. Any error might trigger catastrophe. This religious anxiety is visible in the endless omen literature that Mesopotamian scribes produced. Massive catalogues of omens. If a sheep's liver looks like this, it means that. If an eclipse occurs on this date, it means something else. If you see a raven on your right, if you hear thunder from the north, if you dream of climbing a mountain, each had meaning, each might portend divine pleasure or wrath. The Mesopotamians became the world's first great anxious civilization, constantly reading signs, constantly trying to predict and appease the unpredictable divine will. This is part of the legacy of the catastrophe. The practical governance and technological sophistication passed to Babylon. Marduk's city became the new centre, but the psychological wound never healed. Sumer fell. If Sumer could fall, anything could fall. Babylon could fall, and eventually it did to the Persians, though not through catastrophic divine warfare but through conventional conquest. But the expectation of cyclical rise and fall, the sense that civilizations were impermanent, that the gods were dangerous, that the world could end through forces beyond human control, that became baked into Mesopotamian worldview. And perhaps that is the true warning these texts preserve. Not just do not fight nuclear wars, though that is certainly part of it, but the deeper warning. Do not assume stability is permanent. Do not assume power structures will last forever. Do not assume those who rule have wisdom or goodwill. Do not assume technology will save you. Do not assume your civilization is immune to collapse, because it is not. Nothing is permanent. Not cities, not kingdoms, not even gods, who can be overthrown, exiled, or forgotten. This existential awareness, this acknowledgement of impermanence and danger, makes the Sumerian lamentations strangely modern. We in the 21st century, living with climate change, nuclear weapons, political instability, and technological disruption that we barely understand, have much more in common with the survivors of than we might like to admit. We too live in a time when everything feels fragile. We too wonder if those who rule have our interests at heart. We too see catastrophe as possible, even likely, and we too ask, what will future archaeologists write about us if our civilization falls? Will they puzzle over our texts? Will they wonder whether we really understood what we were doing? Will they debate whether the disasters we record were natural, human-caused, or some combination? Will they speculate about what we could have done differently, what warnings we ignored, what chances we missed to change course? The parallel is uncomfortable but unavoidable. The Sumerians, from our perspective, had time to see the crisis coming. Soil salinization did not happen overnight. Political tensions did not explode without warning signs. Whatever the final trigger, there were years, maybe decades of increasing instability. And yet they did not, or could not, change course. The momentum of history, the logic of conflict, the rigidity of systems, the ambitions of rulers, all pushed toward catastrophe despite whatever warnings wiser voices might have raised. Are we so different? We see our crises. Climate scientists have been warning for decades. The signs of ecosystem collapse are visible. Political tensions simmer. Nuclear arsenals remain, and yet we do not change course, not really, not fast enough. We argue about interpretations of the evidence, we assign blame, we cling to systems that are visibly failing because the alternative is admitting the system is broken and we do not know what to replace it with. The gods are not coming to save us. Whether they ever existed or not, they are not coming. The Anunnaki, if they were real, left or went into hiding or died or were never more than mythology to begin with. The point is, we are on our own. Just as the Sumerians were ultimately on their own when the catastrophe came, the gods withdrew, the texts tell us. They wept from a distance. But they did not intervene. The people died, the cities fell, and the survivors had to rebuild from the ruins with no divine rescue, just human resilience and the stubborn refusal to give up entirely. This finally might be the most important message in these ancient texts. Not about ancient astronauts or nuclear wars or succession disputes among gods, but about resilience, about the survivors who picked up their styluses and wrote the lamentations, who remembered, who mourned, who warned, who rebuilt, who started over, who refused to let the catastrophe be the end of the story. Fell, Sumer fell. But Mesopotamian civilization continued in new forms. Babylon rose, Assyria rose, new cities, new dynasties, new stories. The script changed from Sumerian to Akkadian, but writing continued. The language changed, but knowledge was preserved. The religious centre moved, but temples were rebuilt. Life went on. This is the paradox at the heart of catastrophe narratives. They describe endings, but their very existence proves that endings are not final. Someone survived to write them, someone copied them, someone preserved them, someone 4,000 years later translated them and shares them with you tonight. The story did not end when fell. It changed, it evolved, it continued. And perhaps that is the most subversive truth hidden in these texts. Empires fall, gods come and go, but stories persist, memory persists. The clay tablets survive when the cities that produced them are dust. The warning survives when those who needed it most are long dead. And so we, recipients of this ancient wisdom, this ancient warning, this ancient grief, must ask ourselves, what will we do with it? Will we heed the warning? Will we learn from ancient mistakes? Will we find ways to resolve our conflicts without deploying weapons that poison our own house? Will we build systems that can change course before crisis becomes catastrophe? Will we prove wiser than the gods? Or will future archaeologists dig through our ruins 4,000 years hence and find our own lamentations, our own descriptions of evil winds, our own questions about why those who ruled us led us to destruction, our own prayers to gods who did not answer? The choice, unlike for the ancient Sumerians who lived under what they believed was inescapable divine decree, is ours. We do not have to repeat the cycle. We do not have to let conflicts escalate to the point of mutual destruction. We do not have to poison our own lands in pursuit of victory. We have the capacity, if we choose to use it, to learn from history, to choose differently, to build systems that bend toward justice and sustainability rather than toward exploitation and collapse. The Anunnaki Civil War, whether literal history or mythological warning, or some strange hybrid of both, is not just about the past. It is about the present. It is about the choices we face right now. It is about whether we will finally, after millennia of repetition, learn the lesson that power unchecked destroys those who wield it as surely as those it is wielded against. The tablets have spoken. They have preserved their warning across 4,000 years. Now the question is whether anyone is listening. The Sumerian texts, with all their talk of gods and divine decrees, are ultimately texts about us, about how we organize ourselves into hierarchies, about how we compete for power and resources, about how our leaders' conflicts destroy what common people have built, about how technology, whether ancient weapons or modern nuclear arms, amplifies human conflict to the point where entire civilizations can be erased, about how environmental degradation, whether from poor irrigation practices or industrial pollution, can undermine even the most sophisticated society. The Anunnaki, whether literal extraterrestrial beings or mythological representations of Sumerian elite families and political factions, are a mirror held up to ourselves. Their conflicts are our conflicts. Their failures are our failures. Their tragedy is our tragedy. And their warning is our warning. Do not repeat the war. Do not let ambition override wisdom. Do not deploy weapons you cannot control. Do not poison your own house in the pursuit of victory over your rivals. These lessons are written in the ruins of Ur. They are written in the lamentations. They are written in every civilization that has risen and fallen throughout human history. The question is whether we will finally learn them before we, too, become the subject of future archaeologists' lamentation. Tonight we have journeyed through one of history's darkest and most controversial chapters. We have examined texts that speak of civil war among gods, weapons that scorched the earth, winds that carried death, and the collapse of the world's first great civilization. Whether these texts record actual events involving advanced beings and technology, or whether they are sophisticated mythology, encoding very human historical traumas, they remain powerful testimonies to the dangers of unchecked conflict and the terrible cost of war. The clay tablets on which these stories are written have survived 4,000 years. The cities they describe are dust. The kings they name are forgotten, except as names on a list. The gods they worshipped or feared have faded into academic study and fringe speculation. But the warning endures, the capacity for self-destruction endures, and the question of whether we will heed the warning remains as urgent today as it was when the last priest of fallen Ur pressed his stylus into wet clay and wrote, "Alas, the destroyed city, my destroyed house." The mystery of the Anunnaki civil war, like all great mysteries, is ultimately a mystery about ourselves. What are we capable of? What are our limits? How far will we go in pursuit of power? And at what point do we realise that some victories cost more than they are worth? The answer, written in the dust of ancient Sumer, is clear. Sometimes by the time you realise the cost, it is already too late. The evil wind has already begun to blow.